Welcome to Episode 2 of Grandy's Adventure Storybook, stories for grandchildren of any age, written and performed by me, Andrew Cullen, telling the adventures of Edward, a boy secret agent for the King in the English Civil War. Part 2. Edward and the Laughing Cavalier. Edward rode through the night towards the mill house where he knew his father and his friends would be. He was excited. Today had been a day when, with the help of Rafe de Courcy, Edward had escaped from Sinclair and had been given a special letter to give to his father. He could feel the paper crackling in his inside pocket as he rode. It was the middle of the night, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, and by the light of a nearly full moon, Edward could just make out the shape of the mill house. He pulled lightly on the reins, bringing his horse Shimmer to a gentle trot and then to a halt. He was now a secret agent. Edward knew that this meant that sometimes you had to be really quiet. You never knew when the enemy might be watching. Rafe de Courcy had been quiet, while Sinclair had been asking Edward questions, and so that no one else had noticed, Rafe had signalled to Edward to help him. Edward dismounted Shimmer and walked her very slowly towards the house. He could hear the sounds of the river swooshing past, and occasionally the hoot of an owl. He tied Shimmer's reins to the post and walked up the garden path towards the house. What should he do? Knock on the door? Surely his father would be asleep. Very carefully he turned the handle. The door, as heavy as a church door, opened slowly inwards. The room felt warm after the chill night air. The remains of a log fire glowed redly in the fireplace, and Edward suddenly felt tired. He sank down on a sofa facing the fire and wondered what to do next. It was so dark and quiet. Having got into the house and having awakened no one, he didn't quite know what to do. The fire glowed peacefully. From somewhere he could hear snoring. The owl hooted outside, and Edward fell asleep. What seemed like 2 minutes later, Edward woke up to someone calling his name and prodding his shoulder. A friendly young man's face was smiling at him. "Good morning, Master Edward," said Lieutenant John Thistledown. "Would you like some breakfast?" Edward could smell fresh eggs and bacon being cooked. "Oh, yes, please," he said. John smiled and asked when he'd arrived. "I don't really know," replied Edward. "It was the middle of the night. I crept in as quietly as I could." "You did well," said John, looking slightly puzzled. Edward didn't understand the puzzled look. Surely if he'd done well, John would have smiled. Edward sometimes didn't understand grown-ups. Edward went into the dining room. Sir Richard, his father, was sitting at the table drinking a large mug of coffee. "Hello, Dad!" cried Edward, running to his father and giving him a big hug. "Edward, my brave boy, I knew you were the man for the job." Edward knew that Sir Richard was talking about the letter from Rafe. He reached into his inside pocket, pulled out the letter, and gave it to his father. "Very, very well done," said Sir Richard, opening the letter. "Oh, by the way, what time did you arrive last night? It must have been well after midnight." "It was, sir," said Edward. Now that he was working as a secret agent and soldier in the service of the King, it seemed right to call his father Sir when giving him a report of how a job had gone. "I met Rafe de Courcy in the stables at midnight, so it must have been at least an hour after that by the time I arrived here." "I'm surprised no one heard you arrive," said Sir Richard. "I just thought I should be quiet. After all, the enemy could have been watching." "Quite right, my boy. You're thinking exactly like a secret agent should. I'm very proud of you." Sir Richard smiled. "You were as quiet as a ghost. No one knew you were here until John found you this morning." Suddenly, there was a loud voice filling the room as a large man whom everyone knew as the Laughing Cavalier arrived in the doorway. "Good morning, sir. Good morning, John, and a very good morning to you, young Master Edward." Sir Rowland Greville, on the other hand, makes as much noise as the brass section of a military band on Carnival Day, said Sir Richard, with a rueful smile. "Oh, you mock me, sir," said the Laughing Cavalier with a smile and a chuckle. "Must a chap really be mocked this early in the morning before breakfast? I say, John, any chance of some eggs and bacon?" "Did you notice my son arrive in the night?" asked Sir Richard, suddenly serious. "Oh, yes," said Rowland vaguely. "I was sitting right there, by the fire. I watched him come in and take a seat. If we hadn't been expecting him, I would have tackled him and taken him prisoner. Very good work, young sir." Sir Richard looked at Rowland coolly. And once again, Edward felt there was something he didn't understand. While the men and Edward ate their breakfast, Sir Richard read out the letter sent by Rafe. "Our task of arresting known royalists nearly complete. Only Sir Richard and a few of his friends remain at large, many royalists in the area of Kenilworth. All loyal parliamentarians and those against the king to join forces with the Earl of Essex. Report to Commander Sinclair or Captain Thunder as soon as possible." "Sinclair," said Sir Richard thoughtfully. "So he's back. He was the man asking me questions when the soldiers marched me into the dining room," said Edward. "He told me he was in charge now." "Did he indeed?" said Sir Richard. "And what happened then?" I said, "I think, sir, you are mistaken," said Edward. Sir Richard laughed. "Well said, my boy. It's good to say what you think, but always to be polite, even to someone who doesn't like you." "I didn't like him either," said Edward, and then added, "Have you met him before?" "Yes, I have," said Sir Richard, "but that's a story for another time. Meanwhile, this letter is very useful." Edward felt confused. "Well, this doesn't sound like a letter," he said. "Normally, if it's a letter to you, it would start with 'Dear Sir Richard' and finish with 'Best wishes, Rafe de Courcy.'" Sir Richard smiled. "No, of course it doesn't sound like a letter. Rafe wrote it in this way in case you were caught by the enemy. If Sinclair's men found out that you'd escaped, and then they found a letter written to me, then you would be shot. As it is, if you were found with this piece of paper, there is a chance Sinclair's men would think you were on their side." "But I still don't understand what it says," said Edward. "Well," said Sir Richard, "it tells me that Sinclair's men have caught nearly all the royalists except for me and my friends. It tells me that there are some more of our royalists who are on the side of the king in a town called Kenilworth. It also tells me that Sinclair and his men are going to join up with the Earl of Essex. That means they are heading south. This is very valuable information." "Why?" asked Edward. "Because it means that Sinclair has given up chasing me for the time being, but that also means we need to head towards Kenilworth and join the king's forces. Where we are now, the enemy is all around us. We know about Sinclair, but this Captain Thunder sounds like a nasty piece of work." "Imagine going through life with a name like that," laughed Rowland, taking a large bite out of a slice of fried bread. "Might as well be called Captain Tummyache." Edward giggled, but Sir Richard said, "That's what you'll have, Rowland, if you have too much breakfast just before a long ride." Sir Richard stood up. "John, Roland, Edward, get ready. We leave in an hour." "Where are we going, sir?" asked Edward. Sir Richard thought for a moment, and then said, "We ride together at first. Lieutenant Thistledown and I will then take a direct route to Kenilworth. Captain Greville and Edward, I need you to go to my house to make sure my wife and family are safe."
"But surely, sir, you don't want us to stay there?"
asked Roland. "For a few days, yes," replied Sir Richard. "There might still be some of the enemy around, and I want to know that my family are safe." He looked at Edward. "I know you want to come with me, son, but for now, I need you to do this for me." He smiled. "You're a fine young soldier, my boy, and part of the job is to follow orders." Sir Richard, Sir Roland, John Thistledown and Edward rode away from the mill house an hour later, the horses' hoofs clattering on the gravel tracks and thudding across the fields as they headed back towards Edward's family home. Sir Richard led the way with Edward beside him. When they came to the place where only yesterday Sir Richard had sent Edward on the journey to the house, they stopped. "This is where we part company," said Sir Richard. "Edward, I need you to go with Captain Greville here and look after your mother, Granny, and Susan for a few days." "But when can I come and join you?" Edward asked. This was hard. He loved his mother and Susan and Granny and wanted to look after them. But he also wanted to be with his dad and ride horses and be friends with the king. "I don't know, son," said Sir Richard. "We live in strange and dangerous times. Things can change very quickly. I need you and Sir Roland to decide between you when it feels right to come and join me and the king's army. Until then, I need you to stay alert and be brave." Sir Richard and John Thistledown set out on the road to Kenilworth, while Edward and the Laughing Cavalier rode the 5 miles to Edward's house. Edward told Roland all about the journey he had made only yesterday, how he had arrived at the house to find Sinclair's soldiers and the copper-haired man who turned out to be Rafe de Courcy, the king's secret agent.
"A very clever man and a fine soldier is Rafe," said Roland. "He speaks 5 languages and is very good at disguises. He needs to be. Sinclair's men are nasty people, and if they found out he is on our side, he'd be in a lot of trouble."
"You're right about Sinclair's men," said Edward. "One of them called me a posh little pipsqueak. I was a bit scared, but I was also cross."
Sir Roland roared with laughter. "I love that. You were quite right to be angry. Private Pipsqueak, you are a natural soldier."
Roland gave him a playful punch on the shoulder and laughed again.
"I'm sure we'll have many adventures together."
When Roland called him Private Pipsqueak, it didn't make Edward cross. This was a friend giving him a funny nickname. It made him laugh. When Roland and Edward drew near to the house, they heard voices. They didn't dare to ride to the stable-yard, but instead they tied their horses to a tree in the field and crept as close as they could to the house. There was a ditch at the field's edge. Edward and Roland hid in it and, very carefully, peered over the edge. Sinclair was pacing up and down in front of a group of 3 soldiers. One of them was the mean-looking soldier who had called Edward a posh little pipsqueak. Sinclair looked very cross. "You 3 were on guard duty last night. The boy was in his bedroom, and now you can't find him?"
"He must have climbed out the window, sir,"
said the mean-looking soldier.
"The little pipsqueak won't have gone far."
Roland looked at Edward and gave a silent chuckle.
Little does that idiot know, he whispered.
We don't have time to look for him now, said Sinclair. Now get the women in the carriage, and we'll be on our way. Edward could see his mother, Susan and Granny, being led by two grim-looking soldiers to a carriage. The mean-looking soldier yelled at them,
"You heard what Mr. Sinclair said. Now get in that carriage and stop your snivelling."
Then Edward saw Rafe appear from behind the carriage. That's enough of that kind of talk, Lieutenant Benson. Ladies, if you please. Rafe held the carriage door open and helped them in, then turned to the mean-faced soldier. Remember, Lieutenant, these are women and they're prisoners of war. Well, well, sneered Sinclair. Getting a little soft, are we, Captain? No, Mr. Sinclair, not at all, said Rafe. But we need these women alive and well. If we are to catch Sir Richard and his men, we need to head to the south now. We can lure him into a trap if he thinks his family is in danger, but that will only work if he knows that his family are alive and well. Edward looked at Roland, who nodded sadly. Lady Catherine, Susan and Granny were being taken prisoner by Sinclair. Rafe was doing his best to make sure they wouldn't be hurt, but at the same time still needed to pretend to be on Sinclair's side. Rafe was still talking to Sinclair, something about Essex and needing 3 days to get there, and then he said, "And by the way, Mr. Sinclair..." Rafe was still talking to Sinclair, something about Essex and needing 3 days to get there, and then he said, "And by the way, Mr. Sinclair, Benson is right. The boy did escape by climbing out of the window. It was still open, and I found footprints on the flower bed."
"Thank you, sir,"
said Benson to Rafe. "All right, Benson. Just do better next time," said Sinclair dismissively. "It doesn't matter. The boy won't have gone far." Sinclair and the mean-faced soldier walked away towards the house. Just before following them, Rafe quickly looked around, and then looked directly at Edward and gave him a sly smile. Roland and Edward waited until Sinclair and his men had left, and then followed slowly, keeping about a mile behind. The tracks were easy to follow, the hoofprints made by the horses and the tracks made by the horse-drawn coach. They rode all day. At nightfall they heard Sinclair's voice from up ahead. "We'll make camp here for tonight."
"That's the most sensible thing that idiot has said all day," whispered Roland. "We'll do the same. But let's go back a short way. Sinclair will probably send some of his soldiers out to make sure people like us aren't following."
They rode back a mile or so into a forest, tethered their horses, and together they built a shelter for the night. By now it was dark, and Roland built a fire and cooked some chicken drumsticks over the fire, which they had with some bread rolls. "Where did you get these?" asked Edward, delighted at having this unexpected barbecue.
"In my pack," said Roland with a smile. "A good soldier always keeps some food rations in his pack. You never know when you might need them."
He handed Edward a piping hot chicken drumstick with some barbecue sauce.
"And a good soldier always looks after his friends." Edward smiled. Oh, and by the way, I need to say thank you and sorry," said Roland.
"What for?" asked Edward, taking a bite of the chicken.
"Well, when you arrived so quietly in the middle of the night, I was on watch duty, and I didn't notice you come in. I was sitting in the armchair like I told your father, but I'm sorry to say I must have dozed off."
"Why do you need to thank me?" asked Edward.
"Thank you for not telling your father I was asleep. He would be really angry with me if he found out, and I would be in a lot of trouble. Your father is the best commander I've ever worked for, and I'm saying sorry for letting him down. I was lucky it was you creeping in and not an enemy soldier."
"Oh, that's all right," said Edward, and then remembered a time when he had once had to say sorry to his father for being naughty and shouting. He said sorry once he had been made to sit in the corner, and he remembered what his dad said, which meant it was all forgiven and forgotten. Edward now said those words to Roland. "It's all right. Think no more of it." Edward woke with a start. He and Roland had talked quietly after their barbecue, and at some point Edward had fallen asleep. He had a blanket over him, and he could hear Roland breathing heavily just a few feet away. What had woken him? As quietly as he could, he grabbed the blanket around him and very slowly stood up, straining every sense to listen. The grass beneath him was cool and lightly damp with dew. That also meant he could move silently across it if he needed to. Up above, the stars lit up the sky like diamonds. An owl hooted. And then another from a different direction. This felt wrong. That was no owl. These were enemy soldiers making owl noises as a signal. As soon as he had the thought, he heard a whisper. "I think there are two of them." Silently wrapping the blanket around him, Edward ran silently and blindly across the grass where he had been lying, as there came a crashing of twigs breaking and loud shouting from two directions as enemy soldiers carrying flaming torches and rifles appeared. Edward dived to the ground just a few yards away. He pulled the dark-coloured blanket over him and hoped that in the dark no one would see him.
"Well, well, well," sneered one of the soldiers. "What have we here?"
"This is one of the king's posh soldiers," said another from his hiding place under the blanket. Edward could hear Roland waking up. "Wakey, wakey, my lord," said one of the soldiers.
"Oh, come now, chaps," said Sir Roland. "I haven't had my beauty sleep yet. Anyway, what time's breakfast?"
Edward felt his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst through his chest. The enemy soldiers hadn't seen him. If he could just get away to where they had tethered their horses, then maybe, just maybe, they could get away. So long as he was crawling along where there was grass, he could move quickly and silently.
"It's a bit early for breakfast, my fat friend."
Edward recognized the voice. It was Benson, the mean-faced soldier.
"Fat?" Roland laughed. "Get away with you."
Edward knew that really Roland was telling him to get away.
"When a man is on his own, what harm is there in living well?"
Edward ran as silently as he could manage across the dark field to where his horse, Shimmer, and Sir Roland's black stallion were tethered to a tree. He could still hear the enemy soldiers talking to Roland.
"On your own?"
said Benson.
"I think not. Now, why would I lie to such fine soldiers as your good selves?" Roland was bluffing. "You know what I think?" said Benson. "I think you're one of Sir Richard's men. In fact, I think you helped his son to escape. You're coming with us so you can explain to Mr. Sinclair and lead us to Sir Richard."
Edward's hands were trembling as he untied Shimmer. An idea was beginning to form. If he could suddenly ride in with Shimmer and Roland's horse, in the confusion, it was just possible
that Roland could get on his horse and they could escape. The problem was that riding one horse and leading another at the same time made you slow. Edward could still hear Roland trying to fool the soldiers by standing up and pretending to be pleased to see them. "Ah, you work for Commander Sinclair? Oh, thank goodness I've found you. I want to join your side, and, well, I've heard I've got to report to Commander Sinclair or Captain Thunder. I was one of Sir Richard's men, but he headed south well over a week ago, and he left me behind. Sir Richard is such a fool. He doesn't realize this war is nearly over before it's begun." "Captain Thunder, you say?" There was a different tone to Benson's voice. "Of course," bluffed Roland. "I'm told that Captain Thunder and Commander Sinclair are the best soldiers the parliamentarians have. If I have to ride away with anyone—" Edward knew Roland was really talking to him. "Well, then I can think of no one finer to ride with." Edward became aware of somebody right beside him. A familiar voice. "Hello, Edward." Edward jumped with fright, then realized who it was. Rafe! "Sorry to startle you. Now listen carefully. Ride your horse as fast as you can into the clearing and take Roland's horse with you. Now make as much noise as you can. I'll make some more noise from the other side. Those idiots think Roland is on his own. But how did you know we were here?" "I followed Benson and his men when they left the camp. He got a severe telling off after you escaped, so it was his idea to form a search party to get back into Sinclair's good books." "But how—" "No time to talk now," said Rafe. "I need to get back before I'm missed. I'll make as much noise as I can, and I'll disguise my voice, so they won't guess it's me. Then I need to run back to the camp before I'm missed. Are you ready?" Edward climbed onto his horse. "Right then," said Rafe. "Good luck, young sir." And with a smile, he took a deep breath and yelled, "King's Elite Battalion! Charge!" Rafe slapped the horse's flanks, and Edward and the two horses surged forward. He could hear Rafe crashing through the bushes. The enemy soldiers were confused. "This is a trap! There's a whole army following us! Let's get out of here!" Roland grabbed the reins of his horse and grinned widely at Edward. "What kept you, dear boy?" "Roland, look out!" yelled Edward as a soldier appeared behind him. As graceful as a dancer, Roland turned and hit the man so hard he fell to the ground. As Roland climbed into the saddle, he said to Edward, "It's time we left. These Roundheads are such boring conversationalists." The enemy soldiers were peering at the bushes from where they could still hear Rafe crashing through the undergrowth and yelling like a warrior. The mean-faced soldier, Benson, looked with confused disbelief at Edward as Roland spurred his horse forward and Shimmer followed. Edward smiled at Benson, and then, remembering how Benson had been so badly told off by Sinclair earlier in the day, said, "And by the way, Lieutenant Benson, just do better next time." As they rode away through the dark fields and lanes, Edward and Roland laughed and laughed, and Edward thought that although he'd been afraid, he had never felt so alive as he had on this adventure with the Laughing Cavalier. That was Edward and the Laughing Cavalier, which is part 2 of The Adventures of Edward. Next time, in part 3, Edward and Roland ride through the night to Kenilworth, where the following morning Edward meets the 2 royal princes for the first time.
If you're enjoying Grandy's adventure storybook, please leave me a rating and a review. But most important of all, tell your friends. Because you can take it from me, everybody loves a good story. In the meantime, and until we meet again, goodbye for now.